Yeah, so this talk, it's getting worse and worse, I take it, as the day has progressed. You went from what we should be doing and then increasingly to human evil. And I'm ending up at trying to talk about the worst of evils that there are. So it's getting rather dark, this talk, I'm afraid. But as Thomas was saying, so this project, which is kind of a starting point of doing my next book, so it's very exploratory in nature. And my next book right now, I think, is going to be called something like Transforming Our Social Contracts. So it's much more directly, again, legal political philosophy rather than sex, love, and gender. Sex, Love, and Gender, if you had a look at the book, is a book that tries to, in a certain sense, follow the structure of Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, meaning it has a first part that is the virtue account, and then the second part is the right account. But then I'm doing what he thinks you should do, as it says in the introduction to the Metaphysics of Morals, which is that these accounts of virtue and right, which explores the objective principles of freedom, in a more complete account of the phenomenon under investigation, you also have to make space for moral anthropology. And in other writings, he also says, specifically with regard to right, that you have to use this theory of the objective principles of external freedom or right for freedom and apply them to human historical circumstances via the principle politics. So that Sex, Love, and Gender tries to do that. And also in the process of doing that, tries to overcome Kant's own mistakes when it comes to sex, love, and gender. So I try to present ultimately an account that I think he should have defended if he himself had not yielded to various temptations of evil, which he did. And in particular in that book, I'm exploring his sexism and heterosexism, which, as all of are quite extensive. They're quite extensive writings, so a lot of comments on these two things. Okay, so part of developing that theory, which is related to today, I should just make sure that I know the time I'm supposed to finish at. Okay. Part of that theory proposed a new way to think about, contrary to the existing secondary literature, a new way of thinking about Kant's theory of human nature. So especially with regard to what Patricia mentioned earlier, which is the predisposition to good in human nature, which is an account or sort of a systematic type of account that you find in the religion. I had to go at that one again and try to use it to develop a better account of human sexuality, one that doesn't end up in Kant's sexism or heterosexism. On my account, then, animality does more philosophical work than it tends to do in Kantian theories. And I argue that that's important to capture human sexuality. It's also where you need to go if you want to overcome his heterosexism, and for that matter, his cissexism, though it's not explicit. So part of this book is continuing that work and also then the principle politics. And when it came to the second part regarding the principle politics, so just the general analysis in the second part of the book on sex, love, and gender, part of what I increasingly became convinced of and so proposed is that both as a matter of Kantian scholarship, but also as a matter of legal political philosophy more generally, I think it is interesting, and right now I'm defending it, at least for now, until we figure out why we shouldn't do it, to stop arguing, as is very common, all the way from early modern philosophy until today, that either we find ourselves in the state of nature or we find ourselves in civil society. So part of what I explored there is that, in fact, people whose sexual or gendered lives are in the minority and so are subject to oppressive forces, and also women in various ways, they can find themselves in important ways in civil society with regard to many aspects of their lives, such as they can enjoy rightful private property relations. And yet, at the same time, their own embodiment and that very personal part of their lives is subject to a pocket of what Kant calls barbarism. That is, in order to be able to survive at all, you have to hide who you are. Because if you say who you are, even though you're not wronging anyone, there's a danger of legal threat coming at you. It can both be from other private people, but it can also be from the state. And so I proposed that we should give it up. We should give up the notion, including as a matter of conscience and as a matter of legal political theorists, that we are either in the state of nature or in civil society. We can be in civil society, but find important aspects of our lives in what Kant calls barbarism. Also in that book, I kept developing this notion, my take on Kant's lying to the murderer at the door, which probably maybe many of you knew. I wrote a paper a very long time ago on that, and I've kept working on it, and I think my account now is better. And I developed it in part by distinguishing more clearly and using more clearly Kant's distinction between formal and material wrongdoing. So a feature of that analysis, which I used a lot in that book, is to say that human beings can find themselves in situations where there's no moral good way out, as we talked about, but where the wrongdoing is not properly characterized as material wrongdoing, because the matter coming at you is fundamentally unjust or not rational. But as you do protect yourself in that way against lethal threats of wrongdoing, you're still doing a formal wrong. So part of the complexity of human life is that we can find ourselves in situations where there's no way to get out of it that doesn't involve formal wrongdoing, even though it doesn't necessarily involve material wrongdoing, which is quite useful when you try and understand the complexity of, say, people who are gay or lesbian, and then they face themselves facing lethal threats regarding themselves. So they have to try and hide it and not show it ever, because that can trigger lethal threats. So that was a lot of what I did there. And then maybe the other thing I did, which I'm trying to stick to as much as I can also as I'm moving forward, so far I like it a lot. And I think Patricia was speaking to some of that complexity when she's talked about why or how when we do Kant, or just took her to mean also practical philosophy in general, it is important that we don't just do the moral thinking as if it's a game of reflection, right? Sort of endless reflections on, say, the trolley case or something like that, right? Which seems to be more like an exercise in numbing our senses of morality than enhancing them, as if it doesn't matter. Like whatever gruesome thing I can think up, that's philosophically interesting. And so in that book, I did that in two ways. So the first one was whose reflections and whose experiences are part of what one must pay attention to when one writes about very, very difficult human experiences. And when it comes to women and sexual and gender minorities, I'm a little bit more confident about my own ability to feel that, because I am, on the one hand, a woman, but I'm also married to a woman. And so I know a lot about what that life is about. And so I feel I can, at least most of the time, be quite careful. And also I was the president of the Society for Philosophy and Sex and Love for a very long time. And I listened to an enormous amount of talks and tried to make sure that those parts of that life I don't know, I either don't talk about at all, or I talk about it as consistent with both people who presented that, but also my students. And so part of that was to try and experiment and try to see what such a text looks like when you're not doing what is much more common, I find, and is very difficult to live with in the practice of philosophy, namely that there's a we and them type reflection going on. So what are we going to do about the gays? Or, if you think that the gays also have sex, what about animals, right? Or if you think that, what about? And then you reveal in the reflection that you really don't know what that life is all about. And in academia or in the tradition we inherit, being gay or being a woman means that you should learn to not be affected by those kinds of endless reflections by people who have never really lived that kind of life. So I believe that part of the tradition we're inheriting is actually quite dehumanizing for parts of those who are engaged in philosophy, and is quite excluding, because if you have to be able to listen to endless talks where we are talking about them and you are them, it's just morally exhausting space to be in. And it's definitely not a space in which it's easy to be wise and fun and engaging and vulnerable and going with it, because you become so extremely self-conscious and you kind of constantly dehumanized, and it's not supposed to matter. So I wrote the book from the other perspective, and also ultimately aimed, or tries, it might fail, but it's trying to be a friend for those whose lives it is. So it's not written for other academic philosophers as such. It's not aimed at being convincing necessarily to Kantians, or for that matter to philosophers of sex and love or feminist philosophers. And interestingly enough, in that sense, it's a book that everybody can hate, because Kantians don't like sex, love, and gender. They don't think it's very important. And feminists and philosophers of sex and love don't like Kantians. So it's sort of a perfect hate object, because everybody gets to hate it. And also it's not really written in some ways. In some ways, it's written for people who are women or who are LGBTQIA, and for all of those who want to understand what such a life is. So in terms of the method, is quite different. So in this new book, I am trying then to take on the project of transforming social contract tradition, where I'm trying to keep a lot of this and see how well it goes also when we're trying to rethink or Kant's social contract theory, both as what he inherits or takes on or transforms from Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, but also as we develop it in light of theories that come later, and writings, because a lot of the writings are written by people who were excluded from academia. But when it comes to not just sexism and heterosexism anymore, but also racism and various ways in which to oppress religious minorities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's trying to do the theory not only in that more limited regard of sex, love, and gender, but trying to broaden the scope and show what could a Kantian theory of social contract theory look today if we try and both do the so-called ideal stuff, but also the non-ideal stuff. This particular paper that is called Kant and Arendt and Barbaric and Totalitarian Evil. So the ideas I'm presenting to you, I think, are going to be central then in that new book, or parts of the new book. So let me talk about two tiny little things. Still a little bit set up, but the ideas I'm going to present are going to be quite quick, I think. And then we can all talk together and explore the rest that I don't talk about, but maybe is in the paper. The first one is that it is something very lovely too about being, even if virtually only, in Königsberg, and talk about not only Kant, but also Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt also grew up in Königsberg. I think she is one of the the richest political thinkers of the last century. And if you want to do Rawls as the best ideal theorist, I think she's the best non-ideal theorist. And in particular, I also think she was not particularly good at reading Kant in important regards, including his political philosophy, which she shared with Rawls. He also wasn't good at that. And nobody else was really either. But the combination, she was very inspired by him, I think, in terms of certain philosophical ideas. And I think it's an extremely fruitful position to use as one is trying to develop Kant's ideal theory towards the non-ideal domain. So I think Hannah Arendt, some of the ideas she's left us on evil must be tracking would be on the right tracks, at least. And not that they're complete or anything like that, but I think they're very rich, very deep, and not accidentally so, relating again to method. So Arendt herself believes that some of the reason why she spent pretty much her entire life thinking about evil is the fact that she was born in Königsberg, lived in a ghetto, then moved to Germany, and experienced Hitler coming to power, experienced the entire academia, so all our academic friends who were not Jewish, as for a moment being enthusiastic. And some of them came to their senses more quickly, but she was just profoundly shocked that it was possible that academics and philosophers, and none of them understood what this was. And whereas she's like, have they not been listening to what Hitler was saying? Did they not get it? And this fear of academia stayed with her forever. She never took a permanent position in academia. She always remained skeptical, especially skeptical of philosophers. She doesn't want to be called a philosopher. And she found that the best way she could think of even being in academia was in terms of what she calls pariah, meaning an outcast. So somebody who doesn't belong, and so lives in a world where fundamentally you always have to be aware that you don't belong if you don't want to do well, and people will not harm you so much. And she also thinks, of course, that part of, in addition to then breaking those boundaries, I believe that together with Simone de Beauvoir, she was they were the two first ones to really make it as women in philosophy. I believe that. I think they got their PhDs around the same time, but there could be people I don't know about. In any case, also, of course, as a Jewish scholar, she broke all boundaries, and she had seen and lived human evil. So that she found, she describes it as sort of, you cannot be me, being born in Königsberg when she was, living the life she lived in academia, and then experiencing Nazism and fleeing it. And as a thinker who's deeply drawn to political philosophy, without that becoming very central to what gives your life meaning. So I think that she is one of the deepest, most complex thinkers on evil. Is not possible to subtract from the fact or the life she lived. So hopefully, at least in the Q&A, we can talk a little bit more about some of the details of how I'm going to use her. But a central idea that I'm holding on to in the analysis is then also Arendt's suggestion that when you try and look at something like Nazism, and I think extreme homophobia or extreme sexism, etc., when it's really extreme, it doesn't make sense. That's part of the puzzle. So on the one hand, it just, we want it to make sense. So we keep trying to have it to make sense, but a very deep sense, it doesn't make sense. And that's why it is so exhausting to live with. Reason is threading water, and it's toxic water. Also, she argues quite convincingly, I think, that as the system becomes more and more barbaric, the more it is the case that the distinction between truth and untruth disappears. And increasingly, the legal political institutions are shams. They make you feel as if things are normal, but the real power is increasingly pulled behind the official institutions through secret police and military police, etc., etc. So, and she argues that lying becomes extremely important about everything, and also that the institutions actually no longer function beyond keeping up the sense of normalcy. Okay, just having mentioned that, I don't have time to go much into it beyond that, because I want you to see how I'm going to match her with Kant. So my starting point then, to try and understand then, or link Arendt's theory on totalitarianism with Kant's account of barbarism, in terms of Kant interpretation, it started from a slightly new view. I was teaching Kant's Doctrine and Right for the 1000th time, and I was looking at his definition of anarchy despotism, republic, and barbarism. And you see it in the chat. That's his definitions. And if you have seen my writings on it earlier, or if you read Mary Gregor, or for that matter, Arthur Epstein's books called Force and Freedom, Mary Gregor mistranslated, which is what I realized when I taught it yet again. She mistranslated what now becomes here for me, violence. So when I was teaching it, I was teaching Kant, I was talking through these definitions and law and freedom. And in Mary Gregor's translation, every time there's violence here, she says force. And it's like, there's something very unsatisfying philosophically about force, because what we are after is political force, and you're after political force that in some important sense aims at other human beings, so not just any force in the universe, but is also a very destructive force. So I looked at the German, and then I realized she had translated it mistakenly. So it's actually Gewalt in German, right? So not Kraft or something else that would be more usual or obvious for force, but it's Gewalt. So then I changed that, and then suddenly these distinctions in important ways made much more sense, and especially the one I was after, which is barbarism. Since and that's what the rest of the talk only is going to be about. Barbarism, Kant defines as pure violence, and so the absence of law and the absence of freedom. So I started thinking through that, and first, of course, I thought through some of all the things you can do, and that I kind of did a little bit of in Sex, Love, and Gender, which is, if you use all these, if you combine the thought of that there can be pockets of everything. So let me do that one slightly differently. I think it's easy to understand. These four, anarchy, despotism, republic, and barbarism for Kant, are four ideas of reason. So there are four possible ideas of political societies. So there are four ways in combining the three principles of law, freedom, and violence. They are ideas of reason. And so I started developing that. So what actually follows from that is quite consistent with how I just kept on finding myself arguing in Sex, Love, and Gender that you can have pockets of these things. Because once you switch from ideas of reason to historical societies, it's absolutely philosophically possible to argue, and I think life affirms it, that these forces, the anarchy, the despotism, the republic, the barbarism, they can all be operating at the same time in a historical society. So if you do it very quickly, you can say anarchy, for example, can be used to describe, say, LGBT societies in states like the US for a very long time, where they are free to live their lives, but they're not allowed to marry, say. So they're not allowed to form a family that is legal. Then you can say, so there's a sense in which, or Arendt's ghetto, Jewish ghetto in Königsberg, that they are forced to have an aspect of their life in the state of nature understood as anarchy, right? Not allowed entrance to civil society with regard to some important part of the law. Alternatively, despotism could be any law that involves upholding, say, certain laws that are inherently grounded on a particular religion. So if a state, for example, has public holidays only on Christian dates, that's a despotic law. Because ultimately it is only valid for those who happen to have that religion and not for all the rest. Republican then would be, say, if the property relations were okay, they're rightful, that could describe that aspect of your life. Whereas barbarism then would be in some way that violence is aimed at you. So just, again, one easy example there is sodomy laws, right? So sodomy laws will destroy you if they're upheld by force, if you are who you are, right? Depending a bit on how much, what kind of law it is, but it can be, you can get stoned, or you can just be put in a mental health institution or whatever. So in a historical society, and the examples I've given you probably are quite familiar, and they're illustrations of how various pockets of life in otherwise civilized society, in historical societies, can have all these forces operating at once with regard to different aspects of your life. So the first move then was to become much more clear on moving from ideas of reason, these four ideas of the political conditions, to historical societies is part of how you make the case to explain that actual historical societies have these complexities regarding these political forces. I also thought that once you do that, let's see. Yeah. So once you do that, you can also see actually that in important ways, Kant's barbarism, his own examples are consistent with this. So it would be things like mothers who commit infanticide because having the child would subject them to extreme poverty and shame, or soldiers who are dueling, and so on and so forth. It's consistent with a way in which an area, a pocket of their life is impossible for the state to defend as in the way it should. And so the one way to read Kant on these things is that's why he takes the death penalty off the table in those cases, because the state can't view itself as authorized to judge it, because in it being the case that there's a pocket of barbarism there, it is failing in its duty to be a public authority. So I was okay with that. But then I wanted to see if it was possible to develop it a little bit further. And do I have 5 minutes left or 10? Thomas? Okay, I'm going to just talk for at least 5 then. Maybe 10. So then I was after again mentioned to you, right? So in Sex, Love and Gender, I proposed this somewhat new theory of, new interpretation of Kant's theory of human nature, animality, humanity, and personality. And I mentioned to you that animality becomes much more important on my account. And I thought that's necessary if you want to try and capture human sexuality. And then I thought, well, isn't that relevant also here? Especially also when you listen to Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt says that if you look at the concentration camps, the logic of the concentration camps was not to just kill people. One function that they had was really just to create conditions of living death. So if the point was only to kill people, the whole structure of those camps would have been different. And it struck me that that must be true. I also thought that that's a very useful way to start thinking about even things like a sodomy law or other ways in which racism works, homophobia works, in general, sexism works. There's a sense in which what really directs the violence is a numbing of human beings. So that you can't be who you are. Or if you want to put it in terms of Hannah Arendt, she does the freedom stuff in terms of spontaneity. So the danger when you live in those conditions is that any expression of spontaneity at all risk attracting force all the way up to lethal force, but ultimately just the force that will numb you again. That's the nature of the force. And I thought that one way to capture that is not all you can do. For those of you, I'm doing the speed version a little bit at the end here, but I'm happy to do it again later. It's not possible if you just want what Kant's put into humanity and personality, so to deprive people of their dignity or to deprive them of an ability to set ends or to shame them. That's what I would capture with those categories. But also what he captures with animality, which is self-preservation, sex drive, and affectionate love, or basic community. And in the new theory I proposed, I said that animality for Kant, also for human beings, and you see it quite clearly when you're tiny, is something that has reflexive self-consciousness involved, not reflective yet. So it's a way of striving to stay safe, to eat, to sustain yourself, and to responsive to affectionate love that works for tiny babies. And it works much before we have reflective capacities developed. But this part of us is important not just to understand sex, love, and gender, but it's also important, I think, to understand the type of violence that is involved in barbarism. Because that violence is also aimed at your animality, at your sense of being safe in the world, at your sex drive, at your affectionate love. Because if you can get there, or so the account tries to argue, you get to an aspect of us that isn't fully controlled by our reflective powers. My speediest version of explaining that. So as you can see in Susan Bryson's book, Afterthought, part of the challenge of having been subjected to a very violent rape is that although you know that you still have just as much value, that is not your fault, and that somebody has done something horrible to you, that is not enough to heal. So you have to actually, and healing importantly involves a self-reflexive activity of learning again to be safe in the world, or learning again to trust sexual desire and affectionate love. And you can't get that stuff if all you appeal to is what is philosophically available through humanity and personality in the Kantian account of reflective thought. So then I combine this, okay, in this new thought on barbarism. And then, long story short, there tends to be a move in all barbarism that those who are dehumanized, one aspect of it is those who are dehumanized, they are both talked about as if they are mere animals, but animality is viewed as having no value. So when you treat people in that way, describing them like animals, whether it's done racistly or whether it's done in terms of heterosexist ways of being, they identify more closely with animality, but animality has no value. Also, the barbaric forces are such that they aim to numb your animality. So they aim to numb your sense of being safe in the world, your sense of being at all attractive as a human being, and having affectionate love. And the damage that does to us is that even after it's over, so even after the war, it's extraordinarily difficult to keep living well. So it's not just that it does it in the moment, but it also does very fundamental damage to us for very many people. Last tiny little things. And I just mentioned the last ideas in this paper, just in case you would like to talk about that. The last little move I made I'm making in this paper is that I'm suggesting if you look at Kant's account, you can and try to develop it with Arendt, you can say that we could distinguish between pure barbarism and totalitarian barbarism. Pure barbarism, I think, is when the legal political institutions are such that either one way or another, they allow some human beings, some people under its authority, to wrong others without legal consequence. So, for example, just a quick example, if there's no such thing as rape laws, then it means, and that means that if you're married, you cannot be raped. That's a way to make a space for barbaric space in that society, because that means that people who are married don't have protection against rape against their spouses. And I think that Kant's own examples are of that kind. Also, they are passive. So as long as this is what you do, you have pure barbarism, the legal and political institutions creating these spaces of lack of protection, but it's passive in that it just allows for it by not protecting it. It can also be active. It can also be active, and if it's active, then the state is directly involved in it. So like if you have a sodomy law, right? So then the state is authorizing it, pretending to be able to authorize, so allowing force, violence, against particular segments of the population. Totalitarian barbarism, in contrast, I think, is one where the is also a passive and an active version, since I have 1 minute left. The passive version involves using the legal political institutions to make it impossible for human beings to escape violence. And so usually I think that is done by means of exclusion and specific types of exclusion. So I think that Norway's Constitution of 1814, for example, was like that, because it didn't permit Jewish people and Jesuits to enter Norway. So where are you going to go? Or you can have Europe's current treatment of the Roma people, right? Nobody's welcome anywhere, but you really don't have a place to go. And you are fundamentally unprotected because you're not viewed as having anything similar to citizenship status. And or Nazi Germany stripping Jewish of citizenship, or for that matter, UK's Windrush scandal recently, where some people were stripped of their right to become citizens, even though their families had lived there for generations. Where are you going to go? There's nowhere to go. And the legal political institutions are used to create that condition. The active form is the worst form, and that one is where the state then is doing the terrorizing. And by terrorizing, I just mean you create a space in the world, right, a time space, and you can't get away from the violence. There is no way out. So one way is to just exclude, but by excluding, you're forcing people into a condition where they had no protection. And you know that. The active form is actually using the legal political institutions to do the terrorizing. So examples for me, the obvious examples would be antebellum slavery. It could be Nazi Germany's concentration camp, apartheid South Africa, current Black and Native American mass incarceration in the US, European refugee camps at the moment, and so on and so forth. There are many. But the feature that they share is that now the legal political institutions are actually trapping the people and doing the terrorizing. And there is no way to get out. And there's fundamental violence aimed at you through those institutions. And now I'm out of time. Anyway, so I think that's roughly the theory. I hope you had enough to engage in. And thank you so much for listening.